Ladies and gentlemen, this man, known in 1971 as retired Major Joe Lakich, was D.B. Cooper. I state this as fact without any hesitation or reservation. Let me explain the reasons why. There are a number of major attributes that any suspect must fit to be D.B. Cooper. The first is that he must have the training, most likely military training, to complete his mission. Cooper didn't need instructions on how to don his parachute. He had access to information about how to safely jump from the rear of a Boeing 727. He also knew that Flight 305 could take off without filing a flight plan. Not just any person walking the street has this knowledge. I am a pilot, and pilots represent only about 1% of the U.S. population. But I don't know how to properly put on a parachute. However, Joe had over 20 years in the Army, taught military science and tactics at Gettysburg College, and spent the last 10 years of his military career as an officer in logistics. Joe knew how to plan a mission. As a conservative number, Joe is 1 in 100 for this attribute. Next is the most overlooked evidence in this case, the Dan Cooper connection. FBI Special Agent Larry Carr postulated that Cooper was in the military and stationed in Europe, where he took an interest in the Dan Cooper comics. Also, Albert Weinberg, creator of the Dan Cooper comics, believed D.B. Cooper was a man who not only saw his books, but read his stories. Joe was in the military, stationed in Germany for 3 years in the late 1950s, and multilingual. Joe could have both seen and read the Dan Cooper comics. I will use another conservative estimate of 1 in 100 for this attribute. Other than Joe, there are no suspects who can adequately explain all of the particles found in Cooper's clip-on tie. But working in electronics manufacturing, namely the production of capacitors, these particles align with Joe's workplace. These particles include rare and exotic metals like pure titanium, bismuth, gold, silver, and palladium. This U.S. patent, dating back to 1970, calls for a capacitor that included titanium, bismuth, gold, silver, and palladium in its construction. This is an extremely rare workplace, and Joe wore a tie in this facility. A conservative estimate is 1 in 10,000 men wore a tie in this type of manufacturing environment. Next, to be D.B. Cooper, one must fit the physical description. Most suspects are too short, too stout, don't have enough hair on their head, have the wrong color eyes, and so forth. In Jeffrey Gray's book, Skyjack, on page 119, FBI Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach tells Jeff that Kenny Christensen is too short, too heavy, and has the wrong color eyes. But Joe has a perfect match with the FBI description and is even described as having a dark complexion. And people who knew Joe tell me that FBI sketch sure looks like Joe. These people, and even Joe's son, agree with me. Joe Lacage was D.B. Cooper. So let's use another conservative number of 1 in 100 for this attribute. Now we must consider one of the most important aspects of any escapade such as this one, and that is motivation. Death is a real potential outcome for this hijacking. But Joe had serious motivation. This hijacking wasn't a theft, but a highly charged, emotionally driven event. Joe told Tina that the reason for the hijacking was that he had a grudge to settle. Joe was very vocal in the media and in public conversations, stating that the FBI was responsible for his daughter's untimely death. And again, This is another aspect that differentiates Joe Lacage from all other suspects. For Joe, this hijacking was a publicity stunt, if you will. The 5/8 November incident of October 4th, 1971, in which his daughter was murdered, became old news. It was receiving no additional coverage. It was like his precious daughter, the love of his life, was being swept under the carpet while the murderous FBI went about their business with no punishment or retribution. So unlike any other suspect, Joe viewed this hijacking, live or die, as a win-win situation. If he lives, we have a decades-old mystery that frustrates and embarrasses the FBI. However, if he dies, when his body is found and his identity revealed, the media will swarm back to Nashville to discover Joe's true motivation, and that won't tide well for the FBI. Therefore, Joe is a man who is extremely angry with the FBI and willing to die if necessary to get justice for his daughter. This man is 10,000 for having such an intense grudge. So let's do the math. In 1971, there were 25 million men in the United States in Cooper's age bracket. Since Joe possessed a great deal of knowledge about aviation and flight procedures, he is 1 in 100. Thus, we have reduced the number of men who could possibly be Cooper from 25 million to 250,000. Next, we need a man who was also in the military, stationed in Europe, and who had the ability to read the Dan Cooper comics, which were printed in French. At 1 in 100 for this attribute, we have reduced the number of men who could possibly be Cooper from 250,000 to 2,500. In addition, we need a man who wore a tie into a very unique manufacturing environment. At 1 in 10,000, Joe is the only one with all three of the aforementioned attributes. When all these attributes are factored together, Joe Lakich is 1 in a trillion. D.B. Cooper can be no one else. So now, let's look at some of the minor attributes of Joe Lakich that align with D.B. Cooper. Pat Brown, a woman with a great deal of experience in criminal profiling, did a profile on D.B. Cooper. I have included the link in the description. Although her profile isn't totally accurate, one thing she mentions is that when people commit crimes, their personality comes through. As she states, you are who you are. So let's see how Joe Lakich fits into the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Everyone I talked to who knew Joe described him as a very nice man. Even the flight attendants in a post-hijacking press conference described him as rather nice. From the film The Skyjacker That Got Away, he is described as gentlemanly.
This was not a common hoodlum. He dressed in a business suit. He had an attaché case. He drank bourbon. He was, to those degrees, gentlemanly. The way that James Bond was a gentleman secret agent, D.B. Cooper attempted to be a gentleman thief.
But in 2003, Tina will tell Joe Weber that he was a very sad man. This is quite understandable, as Joe's lovely daughter was murdered just 51 days prior to the D.B. Cooper hijacking. One man who knew the Lakich family and was also a groomsman at Susan's wedding provided a description of Joe. He was a very quiet man, but when he spoke, he was extremely polite. These minor attributes are noted in the FBI documents, and these documents convinced this Lakich family friend that Joe was indeed D.B. Cooper. Joe's extremely polite demeanor was obviously unique. Since Joe spoke to the flight attendants with no particular accent, it was postulated in the FBI wanted poster that D.B. Cooper was possibly from the Midwest section of the country. As it turns out, Joe was born and raised in Chicago. As the FBI postulated, Joe was not a professional criminal. From comments that Joe made about Tacoma and McCord Air Force Base, it is believed he was familiar with the Seattle area. Joe was in the Army from March 1941 until late 1945 on his first enlistment. After December 1942, he was with the 159th Infantry. As seen in the book Order of the Battle, U.S. Army World War II, his unit returned to Seattle from a tour in Alaska in August of 1944. At this juncture, Joe was transferred to the 204th Infantry Battalion. It appears that he may have remained in Seattle for a period of time before transferring to Texas. After the end of World War II, in March of 1946, Joe re-enlisted with the Army for service in Alaska. He may have traveled through Seattle during this assignment. As previously mentioned, Joe was an instructor of military science and tactics at Gettysburg College in the 1950 to 1951 time frame. While there, he played softball on a local team. In late 1951, Joe entered Officers Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. This article notes his graduation from the OCS and also mentions his technical training during high school. In the 1955 to 56 time frame, Joe was stationed at Camp McCoy, now known as Fort McCoy, in western Wisconsin. This facility is about 150 miles from Minneapolis. There are forests, fields, and lakes in this region of Wisconsin. From the Fort McCoy archives, we can see that the activities at this camp included amphibious operations and parachuting. Camp McCoy is not far from the Wisconsin Dells, a popular resort area. Just a short distance from Fort McCoy is a bridge that crosses the Mississippi River, which forms the border between Wisconsin and Minnesota. As we look north crossing the bridge, we can see that this area is quite picturesque. So it is easy to understand when Tina said that she was living in Minneapolis, Joe replied, "Minneapolis, Minnesota, very nice country." Many question why D.B. Cooper chose the older, less maneuverable parachute. For Joe, this is easy to understand. He was 50 years old at the time of the hijacking and had been out of the military for 10 years. He probably hadn't done any skydiving for 20 years. So Joe selected the parachute he was familiar with, the standard conical NB-8. Skydiving expert Earl Cossey verifies the military connection.
We may learn more about Cooper from the type of chute he chose. Earl Cossey, demonstrating the normal freestyle parachute, explains.
The type of parachute that D.B. Cooper used was a 28-foot parachute in a military-type container. And this type of container and harness would be very, very difficult as far as finding the ripcord goes. In selecting this type of parachute, it would seem that he had some military background.
After his assignment at Camp McCoy, Joe went to Nuremberg, Germany for 3 years. His family went with him. Joe's son told me that Joe spoke fluent English, Serbian, and Italian, and a couple other languages pretty well. So Joe wasn't just gazing at the Dan Cooper comics, he was reading the stories, just as Albert Weinberg postulated. In the 2013 time frame, a French-Canadian film was produced about Albert Weinberg and his comic book character Dan Cooper. I have provided a link to this film in the description, but here from the film is Jeffrey Gray discussing the Dan Cooper connection.
The D.B. Cooper case is filled with many mysteries. It is a whole big bag of mysteries all in one. And the fact that the whole thing, the whole hijacking could have been inspired by Dan Cooper, the comic book, to me is extraordinary.
Note that Weinberg believed there was a connection between his comic book character and the infamous hijacker D.B. Cooper, but perhaps he didn't realize how prophetic this connection was. In the comic book series, Dan Cooper has a girl he loves named Randy, but she is tragically killed in an airplane crash. And Joe's daughter is tragically killed in a hijacked aircraft. But as the synopsis of the film states, despite the tragedy of Dan Cooper's lost love, he never strays from his core values of altruism and compassion. And Joe demonstrates this compassion by ordering meals for the flight crew, which are brought on board for the trip from Seattle to Reno. Joe also decides to withhold any knowledge of the hijacking from the passengers, thus saving them from fear and worry. And en route to Reno, before she closes the curtains to the first-class section, Tina pleads with Joe not to detonate his bomb. He puts her at ease by stating he will either disarm the bomb or take it with him. In the following clip, Jeffrey Gray discusses his conversations with Albert Weinberg.
Dan Cooper, the hijacker, he probably aspired to be a hero, like Dan Cooper, the comic book. And when you see the images in the Dan Cooper comic book, this pilot who takes off with these airplanes, who always saves the world, who jumps out of the plane in parachutes, there's a connection. How do we interpret this clue? How do we read it? You know, is Dan Cooper, the hijacker, a Dan Cooper reader? Or is he a comic book collector? What I thought investigating the book was, let's talk to Albert Weinberg. Let's talk to the creator of Dan Cooper. And if we can understand the creation of Dan Cooper, the comic book, then maybe we can understand who this mysterious hijacker really is. What Albert Weinberg told me was that he thought the hijacker was a Dan Cooper reader. And he thought that one of his readers, or a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who had gone a little funky, had hijacked the airplane. And he was convinced that it was either a reader or a pilot or both. For his guts, his courage, his ingenuity, you know, he still is a controversial hero. You know, I mean, he still is now, you know, a hero to many and still an enemy to some.
So now we have a Dan Cooper reader who went a little funky. In his book, Skyjack, Jeff will note that Albert Weinberg states that his character, Dan Cooper, had a high regard for human life. Note that Joe didn't kill or hurt anyone in this hijacking. In addition, Weinberg states that one of the main qualities of his character was that he was very, very sensitive. And Joe was a very sensitive man. His son told me that even 40 years after her death, if his daughter Susan's name was mentioned, it brought tears to his eyes. Dennis Lisney, the ticket agent who sold Joe his ticket, also notes that Joe had a soft voice. But his overall impression is quite interesting, as he pins Joe as a laboring type man as opposed to an office worker. This is a fact that Tom Kay and the Citizen Sleuths need to consider in their evaluation of Cooper. I have been an engineer for over 45 years and have interfaced with many other engineers. We are primarily office workers. Sure, we need to go to the shop floor on occasion or visit a field installation, but most of our work is done in the office. And at larger companies where the labor force is unionized, if you start working with the equipment, the shop people may walk out in protest. Since he wore a tie and worked with the equipment, Joe worked in a non-union environment. In addition, Joe wasn't an engineer, but a production supervisor. It was his responsibility to make sure his team had all the components, tools, and materials to assemble the product. Just as Dennis Lisney had stated, Joe was a laboring type man working with all the equipment in the plant to keep the product moving out the door. And this explains why he had so many particles in his tie. He was a hands-on worker. Even in his obituary, Joe is described as a handyman around the house who liked to tinker. And when he used parachute cord to securely wrap the money bag before he jumped, someone, presumably an FBI agent, described him as innovative. Joe's son told me that Joe was a light smoker. Family friends told me he was also a light drinker as well, usually limited himself to just one mixed drink. Larry Carr confirms this in the documentary, The Skyjacker That Got Away.
Some stories in the media portrayed Cooper as a chain smoker and a drinker. It's an image that Larry Carr thinks is wrong.
I don't believe D.B. Cooper was a drinker hardly at all. You would think that someone that was going to be in a very stressful situation would certainly have more than one drink if he was a drinker, and certainly would have smoked many, many more cigarettes than just the 8 that he did.
And this is another minor attribute that is very important. It is quite evident in the FBI records that the reason for this hijacking was that Cooper had a grudge to settle. If anyone has been avenged by D.B. Cooper, it is the FBI. But probably one of the most important verifications I obtained was from the family and friends of Joe Lacage. When I showed this FBI sketch to Joe's family and friends, they stated, "That FBI sketch sure looks like Joe." And when I provided this document that indicated the reason for the D.B. Cooper hijacking was that he had a grudge to settle, they certainly, in light of what happened to his daughter Susan, understood how Joe could have a grudge. When presented with this document, which concludes that D.B. Cooper had been in the military, everyone stated that it was obvious that Joe was ex-military. But one attribute of Joe Lacage stands out, and that was that he was described as extremely polite. Not somewhat polite, but extremely polite. After all the aforementioned evidence, when friends and family saw this document that described him as very polite at all times, they all agreed Joe Lacage was D.B. Cooper. And there is one other minor attribute that I want to mention. That is Joe's daughter Susan in this picture. She did modeling for the Nashville, Tennessee newspaper. In the background, we see a boat with an outboard motor. Joe had a ski boat similar to the one shown in this picture. So not only did Joe have amphibious training in the Army and the skills to use a boat on the inland waterways that connect the drop zone to Portland International Airport, he had the means to get him to his destinations. Joe's son was one of the last people I talked to about Joe. I told him that everyone else that I talked to described Joe as quiet, polite, and very nice. So I asked, "Do you think Joe was a mild-mannered man?" He replied, "Yeah, he was, unless someone tried to screw him over. Then, whoa, look out." So it seems Joe had a very well-defined sense of what was fair and equitable. So not only is Joe 1 in a trillion, based on the major attributes we know about D.B. Cooper, he also fits many of the minor attributes as well. I don't know what to use for numbers with these minor attributes, but let's just say that the odds that Joe Lacage was D.B. Cooper far exceed even the 1 in a trillion explained earlier. These odds rival a DNA match. The FBI has a seal which is their representation of justice. This description notes that the FBI seal has a blue field and a set of scales on the shield that represent justice. But when we examine the 5/8 November incident, a hijacking which the FBI bungled that left 3 people dead, it seems that justice applied to others but not themselves. They decided to hide behind the shield of big government to escape prosecution. Joe decided that he would have to take matters into his own hands to get justice for his daughter Susan. This painting by Mike Machat is the seal that represents justice for Joe Lacage.